This was incredibly thought-provoking, and I was asked to give my thoughts about this, so I will do that. Perhaps in a little. I'm trying to make it not disjointed, but I was just taking notes as things came up. So I haven't had the chance to sort of synthesize the various points, but let me just sort of jump in. There's this continuing question that has come up already so far today several times and comes up constantly in literature and to some extent more limited in the cases, but about sort of what do we mean by dignity, and this question about dignitas and these various sort of conceptions of dignity that have taken hold at different times and in different places throughout the world. And I guess I want to ask you to think about this notion of dignitas that comes to us sort of from whatever, old Roman times or whatever, wherever we go back to in whatever history. The idea of certain people having dignity, only certain people having dignity, was to say that those people, first of all, were important, right? So there's this notion of dignity is associated with a certain like gravitas, right? It makes something important. And that's important is an important word. So just keep that in mind. It wasn't just about importance in the sense that you care about what they say or that they take actions that are consequential. It meant that they had rights, right? That people with dignities had certain rights. And very closely associated with that, they had certain immunities, right? So you can't sue the king, right? There are certain things that people with dignity are allowed to do, and they're immunized from consequence about it. And also closely tied into this, and this is just sort of the fourth word that I would invite you to think about with respect to people of a certain status having or rank having dignity, is that they were either the sovereign or in some way associated with the sovereign. If they were nobles, they had they stood in the place of the sovereign at certain points. So these ideas of importance associated with rights, associated with immunities, and associated with sovereignty, those are actually all very much part of the way we think of dignity today in sort of the modern jurisprudence of dignity, right? When a court says that something or someone has dignity, the very first thing they're saying is it's important, right? We need to pay attention to this. This is something we should focus on. And as I mentioned earlier, and as we all know, and that's why we're talking about it not in a philosophy forum, but in a legal forum, it's associated with rights. To have dignity is to have rights. So the question, for instance, about rights of nature is sort of associated with, are they important enough to have rights that we should pay attention to what they say, what they are said to say, or whatever. And thirdly, that they're associated with immunities. The idea of dignity, even in the modern sort of UDHR version of dignity and common constitutional jurisprudence of dignity, is that to have dignity is to have certain immunities. If I have dignity, there are certain things you cannot do to me, right? Like torture, for instance, just to give the easiest example. Whereas if I didn't have dignity, if I was a blade of grass, other than in some religious cultures, but in others, if you're a blade of grass, you can quash a blade of grass, and that's acceptable. If you quash an entity with dignity, that's not acceptable, right? So to have dignity is to have rights and to have certain immunities, have certain protections from what other people might do to you. The notion of sovereignty is also really important and interesting. In the US, there's a whole jurisprudence about state sovereignty, right, that has, that is there. But what sovereignty really means is to be, to have like in the national, under international law, for states to have sovereignty, first of all, it means that they have certain rights. It means that they have certain immunities, right? They can't be invaded, right? And it means that they get to control things within their borders. But that's exactly what we mean when we think about human beings having dignity is that I get to control things within my borders, right? My body, my privacy, my sense of self, whatever. I am in complete control of that. And to have dignity or to have sovereignty is to say, nobody else can make decisions for me. I make decisions for myself. So to me, a lot of the sort of the conversation about the source of dignity and what form of dignity or what classification is not necessary to have a full understanding of dignity as it's used today in constitutional jurisprudence, because in a lot of ways, it just sort of comes down to the same kinds of things. And I want to sort of appreciate the four categories of dignity that you sort of ways of thinking about it, and you mentioned sort of two of them. And I want to add another one to this. And they all, again, I think it's worth spending much more time than I have right now to really sort of look at the categories and what do we learn from these different traditions. I was fortunate enough before coming here in September, actually, to spend a month in Bhutan and spend a lot of time with the dignity clinic there and trying to understand the meaning of dignity in Bhutan. And so, of course, in that tradition, and this is based on my extraordinary expertise based on months of conversations there. So for what it's worth, just a few thoughts about it. One is that, of course, the idea of human dignity is there and is part of the law and part of the consciousness and part of the way of thinking. From a Bhutanese Buddhist perspective, it may not be limited to humans. Dignity may apply to all sentient beings. So that's one way of categorizing it. When we think about rights of nature, are we just thinking about sentient nature? Or it may go broader and say to all living things, or it may go even broader than that and say to all things. So there's different ways of categorizing or different ways of explaining who in this society is important, has rights, has immunities, and ought to have some way of controlling themselves, even if it's through like a guardian ad litem or something, somebody who speaks for that entity who doesn't possess legal knowledge themselves. The other thing I just wanted to mention about the Bhutanese experience is that in Bhutan, the notion of dignity, which is very much accepted and very much embedded in the law, is also very much connected to happiness, right? To gross national happiness. And there's a wonderful sort of confluence, again, not the same thing. Dignity and happiness are not the same thing, but a real strong confluence of that. And I just want to mention that because it's a word that we haven't talked about so far, but I think it's really important to thinking about the human experience. So there's that. A few other comments, and I guess I really like the idea of distinguishing or just sort of calling out dignity enthusiasm versus dignity inflation. And that whole notion of dignity, I think that's a great word to use to describe sort of a whole set of issues around using dignity when you don't really mean it, or you're using it to say that something's important. In something I wrote a long time ago, I read all the US Supreme Court cases that mention dignity. And of the 1,000 cases, most of them were about the dignity of a contractor, the dignity of a river, or the dignity of war, the dignity of something, Congress, courts, whatever it is. Very, very few about the dignity of a human being. But that's a whole other issue. But I just want to mention the idea of using the word dignity in a way that may seem somewhat inflationary, just to say, hey, I'm saying something important, so listen to me. I think that, and I haven't really thought this through, so this is truly first impression, first instinctive response, or is to question whether we can keep our enthusiasm for something that seems like it's doing a lot of really good work and doing things that we want the law to do, without going into sort of this inflationary mode, by focusing very squarely on the cases. And so I appreciate your sort of case studies and saying, this is exactly what's going on. This is where dignity matters. This is where it doesn't do the work that we want it to do, et cetera. And I think that, so I was writing notes very fast. I can't quite read all my writing, but that's okay. So I want to sort of invite us to think about dignity as it's actually being used. And I think, for me at least, that's my comfort zone, because I'm not a philosopher. But I am a law professor, so I do spend a lot of my time reading cases and just trying to figure out what those cases mean and how the court has, in any given jurisdiction, has been applying specific concepts to make law real, to sort of bridge that gap between promise and practice, right? So I want to sort of invite you to, on a thought experiment, this sort of theory I have about dignity law. Which is unprovable, but I want to suggest a thought that I've had and ask if it makes sense to you. If, suppose a spaceship from outer space landed somewhere on Earth, pretty much anywhere on Earth, and aliens got out of the spaceship and sort of looked around at Earth and said, what are all these things that are moving about? And some really smart one of these aliens said, oh, I think they're called human beings. And the other aliens in the spaceship said, well, what are they? And they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't figure it out by looking at what human beings do. They couldn't make sense of what human beings do. And one of them got a brilliant idea, brilliant only to a mind like this. Let's read the dignity cases and see if we can figure out what these human beings are. Because my theory is this, is that if you read this global jurisprudence of dignity, you will learn what human beings are. And in fact, I think that that's why, despite the fact that we're seeing cases on so many different issues and so many different cultures from so many different countries and all that at different times, now we've had decades of jurisprudence on this, as you've said, the reason there's this overlapping consensus is that what's important to the courts in these cases, not in the inflationary cases, but in the cases where dignity is really being used seriously to solve a problem. What they're really concerned about is, what does it mean to be human in the 21st century? How should the law respect the human being in the context of a particular case? So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm thinking. These are some of the cases that aliens coming out of the spaceship would find if they happened upon a dignity law library and read the cases. They would learn, first of all, that human beings are biological beings, right? We've talked a little bit about this. Human beings are things that require food and water. They require certain protection from the elements, right? They need shelter. They require, their bodies get frail sometimes, and they require support, or what we would call healthcare, right, to help with their bodies. They would get all of this from the cases. Then they might come across an Indian case, and I don't have time to sort of quote from a lot of cases, but everything I'm saying comes from some case or another, or more cases, but this one I will quote. You can acknowledge if you recognize it, where the court says, well, the right to life, enshrined in Article 21, cannot be restricted to mere animal existence. So suddenly these aliens are learning that these things running around like this on 2 feet are kind of like animals in some ways, because they have these biological needs, but they're not like animals in other ways. How are they not like animals? It means something much more than physical survival. Every limb or faculty through which life is enjoyed is thus protected by Article 21, and a fortiori, this would include the faculties of thinking and feeling. And suddenly these aliens are saying, okay, they're biological beings, but there's this other thing called thinking and this other thing called feeling. Now, what's all that about? So they have to read more cases, and lo and behold, they find more cases about thinking. They find a whole series of cases from India and elsewhere. I'll try to do this. About education, right? Things that help us think. In the case from the Inter-American Court, there's a newly established right to science. I think that's brilliant, but okay. To help education. And the purpose of the education is to help, not only help them think, but help people fully develop their personalities. They would read the case law and see lots and lots of interest in fully developing the personality, whatever that means. And then these feelings. So there's a lot, obviously these human things are really interested in feelings. They're very interested in emotional well-being. They're interested in self-esteem. They're interested in how they feel about themselves. They take their hopes and their dreams very seriously. There are cases about dreams, not in the sleep sense, but in the dreams of your dream for your life, right? Your life project. There are cases about hope as an aspect of dignity, right? So these human things have feelings. They care about how they feel about themselves. They have hopes and they have dreams. They all want to be treated equally, but they also want to be treated as an individual. So at some point, they're starting to read these cases and they're getting, it's like being in law school at first, where the more you know, the more confused you get. So this is what the aliens are going through. You should have sympathy for them. They each want to be treated as an individual. So these dignity cases are a lot about how you'd have to treat every person as a person, as their own person with their individual needs. Cases about gender identity, for instance, are very common cases about things like that. These humans are also very concerned with something called humiliation. They tend to feel it a lot and they want to protect themselves from it. So we have to worry about that. Sometimes they get humiliated from exclusion or discrimination, domination, those kinds of things. So we know that humans have a sensitivity towards that. Sometimes they're just humiliated from discrimination, or just from being treated differently. They're not only concerned about their own self-esteem and self-image and self-worth, they're very concerned about what other people think about them, concerned about reputation, a lot of dignity cases about reputation. They're even concerned about what people think about them after death, sometimes before birth. They're very concerned about their own privacy, but they also really want to be connected to other people. Families and personal relationships are very important to them. This is very confusing for the aliens. There's this thing called marriage, and sometimes it's really important to get into one, and sometimes it's really important to get out of one. Sometimes it's really important to have children, but sometimes it's really important to not have children. There's this thing called sex that the aliens don't understand at all, but humans apparently really like it, but also really want to say no to it. It gets really confusing for the aliens. But it's not just family, it's also community. Aliens want, sorry, not the aliens, the humans, want to be connected to each other. They want to have these relationships with each other. And they want to feel connected on the basis of their choice about who to be connected to. So the aliens are getting this pretty broad sense, right, of what it means to be human from doing nothing but reading these cases, because that's ultimately what these cases are about. What do people need, and what should the law do to reflect and protect what people need? Then the aliens start getting more sophisticated about this. They're reading more and more cases, because how can you not? They're fascinating. And they learn about this thing that humans created called states. And now the aliens are really confused, because humans created these things called states and then gave them a whole bunch of power. And now this thing with all this power is actually abusing the humans who made it. And they're really confused about that. And so they see in all these cases that this line between the state and the individual, who has power to make a decision. And by state, I mean maybe also, I definitely mean states as in nation states, but also maybe communities and other entities. And that gets into that whole question of who has the authority to make decisions for you. Is it just you, or is it also your community and your state? And all of this gets really confusing. Now, I don't believe that makes the law about dignity, it does make the law about dignity confusing, can't deny that. But I don't believe that that's because the law about dignity it doesn't make sense. It's confusing because it's actually trying to do a really difficult thing. It's trying to shape the law to what people need. I had an opportunity earlier this year to interview Justice Albie Sachs, formerly of the South African Constitutional Court. So if you know about dignity studies, he's sort of a lion in the field. And he was talking about some of the cases that he had decided as a justice on the first Constitutional Court of South Africa. And he was talking about how messy these cases were. They're complicated, they're messy. You get your hands dirty when you get into it, right? And he said, but that's okay, because human beings are messy, right? And that's sort of the point. This area of law is very difficult to wrap your hands around. Because what human beings want and need in order to protect what's so important to them is so complex. Thank you.